Hi everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark, and I'm super excited to welcome onto the show Derek Comartin, also known as Code Opinion, on Twitter and his blog codeopinion.com. So welcome to the show, Derek.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, that's all right. Thank you for agreeing to be my guinea pig as the very first guest on this show.
Perfect. Appreciate it. I think I reached out to you originally once I knew you were doing it, so...
Well, I couldn't ask for a more friendly and helpful guest as my first guest, so I greatly appreciate it. So for the listeners' benefit, we actually recorded a conversation a few days ago, and we covered lots of different topics from CQRS to MediatR, functional programming, user groups, public speaking, .NET Core migrations. I think we covered everything, didn't we? But then afterwards we realised that we'd spoken about CQRS and MediatR, but we hadn't actually said what it is. So we decided to do another recording, and hopefully by the magic of Audacity, I'm going to try and splice them both together and make it sound seamless. Well, that's kind of the plan anyway. Another thing we didn't cover was an actual intro. So could you just give us a bit of a background on yourself and what it is you do?
Sure. So yeah, I've been, I guess, in the software industry as a developer for, I don't know, a little bit over 20 years now. So I kind of started my first actual programming job was in the late 90s, I think like 98, 99, somewhere in there. So I'm officially an old man in the industry. And yeah, I pretty much always have been developing kind of line of business in different domains. Never really got into any kind of pure tech stuff or gaming or any of that. It's always been line of business. So that's kind of been, not intentionally, just that's kind of what it's been. So I've been in all over the place in terms of that, from e-commerce, that's kind of how it started out, to distribution, to manufacturing, some accounting, transportation in various forms. So a lot of different domains all over the place, which is, I think now in hindsight, been great because it's given me a lot of just different insights into different domains and how some are similar and how some of them are actually really similar to what we do in writing software. So it's been pretty interesting.
So going back to our previous conversation where we spoke about CQRS and MediatR, which thanks to a bit of Audacity editing will appear later on in this podcast. CQRS, there seems to be a lot of confusion around this term, with people throwing in event sourcing and various other stuff into the mix. Could you give us a quick intro into what the term actually means?
Yeah, so a good thing to kind of clear it up, because I do think it's one of those things where it's gotten conflated with a lot of other things, like you just said, with event sourcing, and that's just because they fit so well together, and because Greg Young has often, I mean, he's the one who coined the term CQRS, and he's the one that's really been promoting event sourcing over the years. So I think that's why they kind of get conflated a little bit. But Greg said this so many times, and I don't know if it's still up on his blog. He used to have a blog called Good Enough Software. You can probably find it on the archives, but he had some really good posts in there, and I don't know if it was specifically on there, but the idea being is that it's really just where there used to be two objects, or where there used to be one object, you now have two. So instead of having a class that represents behaviors such as being able to, say you have a particular class that's going to change state, and some methods that change state and some methods that return state, you are going to separate that. So you have some classes that only return state that are queries, and then some classes that are only changing behavior, and just having that distinction between the two. And it's really just an extension on CQS, which is stating kind of at a small, like a level deeper than that, is that methods to that kind of idea is that you have methods that only return state or mutate state. Greg was just taking it a step further, saying that it's above just the method level and it's going to like a class level. So that's as simple as it gets. I think where a lot of the confusion comes from too is that when you search for CQRS, or even probably if you do like a Google Images search, you're going to see a diagram that has kind of like a UI that goes to this command side that then talks to a domain model, that then publishes an event to an event store, that then publishes that to an event bus. That gets on some read side that has a separate database for a kind of query model. And it looks like this, like a big loop. And while, yes, that is implementing CQRS, it doesn't need to be all that complicated. There's a lot of other stuff in that diagram that's kind of bloating the idea. And I think that's where a lot of it stems from, is just people talking about other things along with CQRS, like event sourcing, like messaging, etc. So I think that's where a lot of the confusion gets in, and why it seems very complicated. Because I hear that a lot is, oh, CQRS, that's super complicated. I don't need that. And it's, well, yeah, but you're probably thinking of CQRS in the sense of that you're using event sourcing with it, that you have a rich domain model with it, that you are using messaging to publish events or commands. And get rid of all that stuff, and it's just about separating the logical reads and writes, basically.
I can imagine that being very off-putting when people Google for CQRS and see all that kind of stuff as well. So how does MediatR fit into this pattern?
So I think where it kind of lies is that MediatR is just a way of doing request response for the most part. So you have a request object that really represents, if you want to think of it this way, the parameters on a method, essentially. So it encapsulates all kind of what the arguments are for what you actually want to do. So you have a request object, and then you pass that request object to the MediatR, which then in turn realizes, it figures out which, there's a handler for it, what's actually going to handle that request. And through DI basically constructs that handler and then invokes that handler. So the idea being is that you're completely decoupled from the producer and the consumer, meaning the producer, whatever is constructing the request object, you don't know what's handling it. You don't know the internals of that. You just said, here's a request, do something with it, MediatR. You figure out how to invoke this thing and where that lives at, and it handles all that. So it's really useful in, like I have some blog posts and videos related to this, is that I've found it that kind of method the most useful when you're trying to use it between integration boundaries. So for me, that would be, I think most people that are using it, between ASP.NET Core and your application. And the reason why I think it's really useful is because it allows you to start thinking about your app not so much as a web app. That's how I like to describe it. Is in creating a web app's fine. If you're just creating, like I'm creating an HTTP API or like a server-side rendering MVC style app, that's great. Like if you want to create a web app, just realize you're creating a web app. If you're putting things heavily into your controllers or your controller actions and you want to couple to MVC or whatever it is that you're using, so be it. Just realize you're doing it. In most of the apps that I've had to create, is they're bigger systems. They are not going away anytime soon. So it's not that we're creating an app. It's we're not creating a web app necessarily. We're creating an application, and one of the interfaces to it just happens to be HTTP, just web. So if you think about ASP.NET Core, it's we want our controllers to do HTTP stuff. Like, you know what I mean? Serializing from inbound what that HTTP request is, status codes on the way out, and serializing on the way out potentially. Our app, we want to kind of segregate from that. Let MVC or ASP.NET Core do what it's good at, which is the HTTP stuff. And then let our app just be our app that implement use cases and all the different features and all the different logic that needs to happen. So that's what's cool about MediatR, is kind of what I call converting from a HTTP request to converting it to kind of an application request, so that you're not intermingled between your app being so coupled to HTTP.
One of the things I like about MediatR, it just forces that one handle method. So it kind of makes you, rather than having a controller with lots of things, then just having that pattern, almost guiding you down the pit of success, is that the word?
Yeah, I think it's interesting with MediatR because when I did that video, I had a lot of comments on the video itself as well as on Reddit. And I think people bring up some pretty good, the people that were against it or using MediatR. The general argument I would say is that because it's adding so much loose coupling, because if you have a request object, you don't necessarily know at all, even through like the language and types, you really can't tell immediately what handles that request, right? You'd have to basically look at the actual request, kind of find references, and then see where it's being used at, to what handle method it is. Like, there's no direct association to it. And that's what makes it great, in the sense of where I consider it the best use is between integration boundaries. So an integration boundary being exactly what you said, like say some controller or something in, say, a web framework or wherever it's top level, and then getting that request out to your code. That's the way I like to describe it, is if you're thinking about ASP.NET Core, is really getting rid of, turning it from an HTTP request into like your own application request. And that boundary, like from ASP.NET Core framework to your code, then you don't have any of the framework code in your code. It's just your code at that point, right? So I think it's really useful for integration boundary stuff. Where I think where people start getting it wrong is when they start using MediatR within their own application code, right? So I have one handler that calls mediator.send to another handler, right? And then you are, at that point, really what you're trying to do is just make a function call. But because it's so MediatR, the way it works with kind of, I call it like route to type. It's like sending that message, routing via all the type information. You lose all that, I don't know what to call it, like navigation. I don't even know what the word is. It's like just to be able to find where that request is and navigate that code becomes a lot more difficult. That's the argument I generally hear against it. People are like, I lose all that, and for what benefit? Couldn't I just call some function in the controller? And oftentimes I'm like, yeah, you could. But then you would lose if you're using things like MediatR's behaviors, where you're making the request like kind of like a pipeline, like an ASP.NET Core middleware type thing, where you're making a request pipeline. Then you lose that. You can't just call a function to some handler, right? You're going to lose all the benefits of that pipeline. So like a lot of the comments said, in my reply to a lot of them, is I think it can be overused. I think like a lot of stuff is people start using it, people see it in examples, even my examples, and then think, oh, I should definitely be using this. Like it almost becomes like a best practice or something.
Well, it's almost like the cool and shiny, so we must use it sometimes. And I think a lot of these technologies do fall down that path. With MediatR, how do you deal with, like, one issue I could often see in my own code using MediatR is I've got an ASP.NET action, so control endpoint, calling MediatR, but then the action needs to return a status code, and that status code kind of gets decided by the business logic, but it's almost like it feels like I need to have this mapping layer from a business logic enum to a status code just to decouple it. Do you always do that decoupling, or do you just pass a 200 through?
No, basically it's exactly what you're alluding to, which then, yeah, that's another complexity of the whole thing, is how do you want to return, like for most stuff that is, say, just is a, there's just like a mapping that has to occur. So for example, if you're not returning anything, it's just void, or in the old one, it was like unit.value. I don't know what it is now. Just like it was a unit. That just automatically would return a 204, no content. And then if there was actually some result, then it was a 200, and then get serialized down to whatever you're serializing to. But if you want to return some type of validation error, some 400 level type response, how do you map that? One of the ways is just purely by exceptions of mapping, kind of like with you can do this with problem.json, which is just map different type of exceptions to different type of response codes, status codes with different types of content in that. Or, in your controller, having some type of mapping between instead of returning nothing, returning some type of like either type. So you have like, it's either something good or some validation error. And then, you got to map to that validation error to some status code, some 400 that you want. So there's additional stuff there. There's additional work that whether everybody goes down to those lengths to doing it, I don't know.
I suspect a lot of people will be passing status code straight through. It's interesting that you're talking about some functional concepts as well with either and this kind of stuff. Unfortunately, .NET doesn't natively have that. But I know I've had a few .NET Oxford talks from Simon Painter. I don't know that you know him, but he's done a few functional talks, which has been basically functional programming in .NET. And I think they're online, so I can include some in the show notes, but some links. But they are really interesting, almost mind-bending talks if you're not used to doing functional programming.
Yeah, I started, I don't know, years ago, kind of got into this a little bit of a wormhole where with different things like exceptions and null, and null's a little bit different now with all the new null reference types in C#. So all the examples I usually give with null are a little bit, I wouldn't say outdated. I still think they're relevant. But yeah, it's just a lot of things that I think that C# make easy to shoot yourself in the foot. People don't see it that way, though. People see it, I kind of call it like the Wild West a little bit, where it's just a free-for-all, where I don't think it's the pit of success. I think there's a lot of times that like with throwing an exception, for example, is you have no idea as a caller that you need to handle an exception potentially. You don't have a clue. Like, yes, you can annotate methods, you can have documentation, but there's nothing forcing you down that road. It's kind of the same thing with null. Say prior to null reference types is, okay, so the method returns a string. Am I handling a string? Am I handling a null? Like, I got to handle both, right? So, but nothing forces you to do that. Like, it's not like really a pit of success, in my opinion. So, when we're talking about something like either or maybe, like maybe is a great example for getting around null, is I just think that gets you more in the pit of success. So, when we're talking about like mediator and returning, like rather than throwing, doing something like either, where you can say, okay, this is the happy path, this is the good path of success, and then if something goes wrong with validation, whatever, here's that side of the equation. And with either, in most implementations in C#, you then have to handle both situations, right, on what you want to do with it, because it could be either. So you have to handle it from a caller's point of view. So it's kind of, I wish some of that stuff was built into C#, to be honest with you.
Well, there is a library called Language Extensions, which has a lot of this stuff in for C#. I'll make sure I include a link in the show notes. One thing I really like about this stuff is chainability, because like most .NET developers are used to link, but that's kind of the limit. But and I see a lot of people to actually try that using builder patterns where they've got to build a class where they return this just so that they can then chain methods in it together. But when you start adding either and all that kind of stuff, again, this is in Simon Painter's talk, which I think was recorded. So if it is, I will include a link in the show notes. But he really spoke about being able to get rid of having all of your code wrapped in try-catch blocks, because you can include that as part of the... So basically, it still goes through the fluent syntax, but doesn't call a REST if an exception's been thrown midway through, if that makes sense.
Yep, no, for sure, yeah. Yeah, I think you just need to get exposed to it a little bit, maybe, and then it may seem weird initially. I think sometimes it may seem a little bit more, depending on how you're doing it, a little bit more cumbersome. You're like, I just want to write an if statement, but the point is, so you're not writing an if statement, or like that it's kind of almost as if the if statement sometimes is forced upon you. Like when we're talking about something like maybe or either or any of those types.
Well, I remember when was it? It was a few months ago. I wrote probably longer actually. I wrote a blog post about writing succinct C#, and it was talking about some of the more modern language syntax So like the double question mark dot. A lot of them around null, and also using link and expression body members. It kind of almost went viral. There was definitely two types of replies. There was some replies which was saying, I love this, this is amazing, everyone should be doing this. And you could tell they were more from a more functional background. But then you had a whole bunch of maybe older school developers which were like, no, this is terrible, it's not more readable or anything, even though the examples it clearly was because there was less to read. And I remember one reply was saying that they said that this isn't good because it's really hard to add stuff to it. And then I replied back to that saying that in my experience, that's actually a bad thing, because quite often the horrible code I've seen in code bases in the past have big long methods where a new requirement comes in from stakeholders. They edit a big long method that's already long anyway, add if statements and start adding stuff. And you end up with this horrible to maintain big long method, pages long. And by trying to do it more functionally and having smaller methods, like using expression body members where you can, so they're really small and you can compose them, it just gets rid of that. And the fact that it's not easy to extend a method is actually a good thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's right when you said I think of like sprinkling if statements. It's like I hate seeing sprinkled if statements placed. Like you said, requirements change, something needs to get added, and the easiest solution oftentimes is, depending on how it's written, just to sprinkle an if statement somewhere. And it's like, that's not, long run, that's not helpful most times.
Well, I think my colleagues at work get fed up of me in doing PRs and saying, that could be an expression body member, so good that. And it's kind of, just gets rid of the braces, it gets rid of the return statement, and it's just much more pure. It just feels a lot, and smaller as well.
Yeah, I think it's just what you're used to. I think if it's, I don't know. I think it's, if you've been keeping up with kind of the seemingly relentless feature updates that make some of this easier. I know there's two camps to that too. It's people that think, and I'm somewhere in the middle of, there's so many new language features that it's hard to keep up to a little bit. I mean, the only saving grace is Writer telling me what's a new way of doing something. That's the only general way that I notice some of these changes. So
that's the best way to learn, though, isn't it? When a new version of C# comes out, that is how I learn most of the stuff. It's kind of, Rider prompts me. So we're going to take a short break now for a word from our sponsors, Everstack, which is my own company which does software development and consultation services. And you can find more details at everstack.com.
I was just talking to one of my coworkers right before this. That's why I took a few minutes there, because we were talking about this, about how autonomous we are. Like, we've always been remote since the company started. And I was saying how if somebody new joined our team, I think we'd have to figure things out because it'd be very difficult. We all know the app so well. We know the domain that we're in so well. We've been in it for so long that for somebody coming in fresh that doesn't know anything, and remote again, and pairing with them and video sharing all day, we're just so not used to that. We're just so used to being autonomous, asynchronously messaging. Yeah, we jump on video chat all the time, but it's just this very autonomous thing that we have. Unless you're like a super introvert, and then you would probably love it. But I could find how people could find it difficult on how we work, because we're just, it's just, I don't know. I'm curious of how many companies, because I've never worked with, this is the first time I've ever worked, I've been doing it now for 6 years, but where we're all fully remote and work this way. So I don't know. Like, I'm assuming you're remote right now.
So I was working Monday to Thursday in a company before the lockdown. This was a contract, but in an office. But I've been working Friday remote for like years for a different client. And then the lockdown happened. I started working remote, and then the company went under. And I luckily quickly found another contract, which is 100% remote anyway. And we actually do pair programming all day long remotely, which is really interesting, because I thought that would be hard work. But actually it works really, because everyone gets on well, we all work together, we all think in the same way. And it's company, it's kind of, there's lots of like water cooler chat throughout the day. So it's not like you're just on your own in a room, isolated. Is that how, you mentioned pair programming before, do you do a lot of pair programming?
We do, like we were talking about this morning with Carl, we don't, it's a more of a, when we're collaborative, it's about discussing the domain and all getting a mutual understanding of either something we're working on or something that needs improving. Really, like, it's usually about the heart of the thing we're working on, is what, like, the real core to what we're working on is what we communicate about. And then, but the interesting thing is, like, when we're working on whatever it is we're working on, if you have a really well-defined idea of what it is that you're working on, then there's just less collaboration, which feels, you feel segregated a little bit, because it's like, we'll still communicate, we still do code reviews, there's a lot of communication that goes on there, but it would be different if we were in an office, because it's just, you can walk to somebody's desk and just interrupt them, versus right now, because we're so used to being asynchronous, it's like, you'll send a message, or maybe you won't, because it's like, you're pretty clear about what you're doing, and maybe you're like, yeah, I'd love the feedback right now, but I'll just do this, whatever. Like, there's a lot of, it's just a lot, it's like a lot on your own awareness to reach out to somebody, versus I think you can just get it kind of quote on for free when you're like going to get a coffee and you walk by somebody's desk, right? You got to really go out of your way to do it, which I feel like is more and more so happens to us, because the more experience we all have in it, it becomes just like second nature to us. We know the domain so well. I've been in it for 6 years. Like, there's not much that comes up that's like, oh wow, like I didn't know that. Like, there's a lot of it's just kind of like, oh, okay, that I didn't know that, but it makes sense. None of it's like, oh, I have no idea how this works. It's all pretty clear to us now.
And I guess even just design patterns you're using within the code base, where at the start of a project or someone new would probably want to check in with someone else. Are we following the patterns that the company follows?
Exactly, yeah.
But if you know it so well, then there's less. That's
what I mean. It's like we all have. I've always described it this way. It's we kind of, like you said. There's a certain everything's established already. Like how we work, how we do things, how you're implementing something. That to not implement stuff the same way everything else is would be like, you'd be really going out of your way to really try hard not to do something the way that everything else does.
Yeah, I think definitely when you've got a code base where everything is so uniform, as you say, but it's when you're working with code bases where 200 developers have worked on it over 200 years and every design pattern under the sun.
Yeah, we're super small, so it's like most of the stuff, it's like there's only really been one person that's worked on the code base that isn't here anymore. So and that's the other thing, is like the app's fairly large, so but most of us work kind of in certain spots and places sometimes. So it's when you're working on for like a particular part of the app for a little bit, it becomes so like there's certain sections that you just gravitate towards that you deal with. So I don't know, it's interesting. I don't know. I always enjoyed this remote thing, but there's moments where I'm like, I wish I was in an office sometimes.
I've not had that yet, to be honest. I probably should have done, but I quite like working at home, to be honest. I think also because I saw a tweet, I can't remember who it was early today, was asking why people enjoy working remotely, what are the different reasons? And I replied, one of the reasons is just because I've got a decent home setup. I've got the standing desk, multiple monitors, decent webcam and mic and things, and also quick access to the kitchen. So if I get hungry, you've got all your stuff.
Yeah, it's the comfort of just being at home,
and no commute as well. So.
And no commute. That would be my top two.
Well, the thing I missed at the start was my commute, because I used to listen to lots of podcasts on that drive. Well, a few contracts ago, I was getting the train, so I would take my laptop and get my own stuff done, .NET Oxford stuff. And then the next contract I was driving, so I'd listen to podcasts on the way. And now I've started going for morning walks and runs. That's my commute. And I listen to my podcasts whilst doing that. And I'm getting exercise and learning at the same time. So it still works.
Yeah, no, I'm all for it. Yeah, I got to force myself into. I usually go around lunch to go for walks, and it's like hit or miss whether I actually go do it or not. But especially because it'll start getting crappy here in the coming months, it'll be a little bit more difficult to start doing it. So
Did you mention earlier that you were up for doing a dev tip?
yeah, so the the dev tip, I don't even know if I would call it. Well, it is a dev tip, but I've been saying forever now that for a couple reasons, that all the apps, I've never written a game. I've basically all the apps I've ever written or that I live in for 20 years now has always been kind of line of business in various domains. So like I said, I'm in transportation now. I was in distribution, accounting, manufacturing, so a bunch of different domains that I've worked in. And I would say the mentor that I had kind of in the middle of my career wasn't a developer. It was an accountant, oddly. And from that moment on, and then somebody that I worked with shortly thereafter was probably the best developer that I ever worked with. And because they struck this incredible balance of developer, but having incredible business insights and really understanding the domain that they were in really, really well, that they were also new to, just had a real business sense. I don't really know how else to describe it. So I guess my dev tip is if you're in line of business and you're writing these types of apps, and whether you are not even necessarily a consultant or anything, but just to get an understanding of the business you're in, like deeply, even from like an accountant money side of things. I always found the reason why the accountant was so insightful is because they've seen the entire business. They've seen how everything worked because they see where all the money goes in and out of. Yeah, that's kind of my dev tip is less tech, cut some of that out a little bit and try to find some room for more of the domain, the business side of it, and try to get some better understanding there. Because they do translate from, even if you're in one domain or the other and you move to something else, there's a lot of takeaways that like, even if they're not exactly the same, obviously, there's things that you can translate or makes you question a little bit differently about how things are work and what their differences are. So yeah, business side of things.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, the reason I mention about dev tips is because we had a period in .NET Oxford at the end just doing dev tips where anyone in the audience could come up 30 seconds mark, that kind of 30 seconds time, almost not on a stopwatch, but it was like around 30 seconds, and they would give the dev tip, hand over the mic to the next person. And we did it for a few meetups, but then there wasn't that many people standing up, which was a bit of a shame because I think everyone enjoyed the dev tips that when people did come up. So when I was thinking about this episode, I was thinking it'd be really nice to actually just start doing dev tips at the end. One of my favourite dev tips is, and it's a shame because this is Windows only, but I don't know have you used LinkPad?
I have, yeah.
So I find a lot of .NET developers don't even know what it is. To be honest, because of the name, like years ago before I started using it, I assumed it was just a tool for learning Link, where actually it's just so much more than that. And I use it every day. It just saves me so much time. I've got a series of blog posts about like LinkPad tips and tricks. But that's my dev tip. Just if you're on Windows, I think there's other stuff which is cross-platform now. There's something called RoslinPad, which I believe does very similar, not quite as polished as LinkPad, but it's Windows Linux Mark. But yeah, so that's my dev tip. I'll include a link to LinkPad on my blog posts in the show notes as well. Is there anything else that you want to promote? I know you've got, for people that don't know you by name, Code Opinion is probably more well known.
Yeah, that's what I am on Twitter. I have no idea how that started, because that's what my blog is. I think that's probably how it started, is because my blog. I remember a long time ago I was thinking, what can I use for a domain for a blog if I started a blog? And that's what I came up with. So yeah, codeopinion.com, that's what it is on Twitter, on YouTube. It's not, I don't know how the link works for that, but it's more of the channel. But I guess if you search for that, you'll find it. Most of the stuff that I put on my blog is also on the YouTube. They kind of like complement each other is really what I'm trying to do. So
I can definitely include that in the show notes. That's amazing. Thank you so much for joining the second episode.
yeah, thanks for doing it. It's cool.